Hi, everybody. Welcome to our show. Today we have an incredible guest, a well-renowned advocate for human rights, Brian Bellerose, someone who has gone around the world, who indigenous to his nation, to his land, who understands the right of the indigenous uh, person, and who understands of why a person should be against any type of form of colonialism. He has gone around the world advocating the rights of all peoples who belong to any type of land and a land that has culture, that has language, and so forth. Interesting enough, he's also promoting and defends the Jewish right to Israel, to the land of Israel. There are those who question his motives, the question why he would do such a thing. Why would anyone, he says, keep calm, Zionism is on. And why would anyone want to be a Zionist? So let's ask you personally, why do you want to be a Zionist? My first question, how did you get into human rights itself?
Well, I don't really have a choice. I'm Métis and I grew up in Canada. So if anybody that kind of knows what I'm talking about in regards to the native struggle knows that Canada has this reputation of being like super nice and apologetic. And, the joke is that we say sorry if we step on your foot kind of thing. But the reality of Canada for a native person is very different. So, when I was growing up, we used to joke all the time because like the kids from the reserve, when we played hockey, we would go play in town and we had this reputation that we were really rough. And it's like the truth of the matter was we were just really good. So, they would get upset because we'd beat the heck out of them. And then they'd be like, oh, it's because they play dirty and they're rough. And it's like, the reality is very different. So growing up and seeing these double standards, what I started noticing when I was younger was that the mainstream has a narrative that it likes to portray itself as, because it's the mainstream, they portray themselves as very centrist, middle of the road, open-minded. And meanwhile, the reality, coming from our perspective is very different. So I had no choice really but to get involved in human rights, because if I didn't, the human rights that were being impacted were my own. So it's one of those things where, it's like I tell Jews that are fighting anti-Semitism, like, you want a medal? Like you're fighting for your people. You're fighting anti-Semitism because it directly impacts you. Like you're not fighting anti-Semitism, on behalf of someone else. You're fighting for your people, which is, for me, like when I fight anti-Semitism, I look at it in a broader perspective as well. Like to me, the Jews are an indigenous people. And if I don't stand up for all indigenous people, then why should I expect anybody to stand up for indigenous people at all? So for me, standing up against anti-Semitism, it's the exact same thing. I'm standing up against an anti-indigenous hate that if I don't stand up against it, it just propagates and eventually it infects everybody. So those are the kinds of things, like when I talk about this stuff, I really try hard to make people understand that I'm not talking about parallels so much as I'm talking about the exact same thing. Like when you take a look, the people that really hate Indians in Canada, 9 times out of 10, they're anti-Semites. So it's not really a different struggle to me. To me, it's the same struggle.
Very interesting, very profound. But to the viewer, the viewer may see, just a word to the viewer, sometimes our mouths may not be in sync. It's because internet connection, so don't think it's your screen at all. And yeah, going back to what you're saying before. So basically you're saying that the fight, your struggle for human rights is a personal one. It's basically a matter of survival. It's a person who has been on the other side of the have and have nots. But still, yeah, I can understand that human rights. I understand very well that you're talking about the rights of the American Indian, the North American Indian, South American Indian. Okay, we have a history of that. They've been here for many, many years, for thousands of years. But let's face it, the Jewish people have been all over the world. So they're indigenous to Germany? Are they indigenous to France? Are they indigenous to Tunisia? I mean, let's be honest now. How could it be indigenous to this quote unquote land of Israel?
So, it's funny that you brought that up, because I'm actually starting a podcast where I'm going to be talking about indigenous rights, because there's just so much misinformation out there. Like, for me to explain indigeneity, we don't have enough time, but I can give you kind of a brief overview. indigeneity is basically, it's based on what we call the 5 aspects of indigenous identity. So the way that I teach children is I say, hold up your hand. Now, language, land, culture, blood, spirituality. Now, those 5 things put together, working together, just like a hand, fingers on a hand, when they all work together, they give you what indigenous identity. Now, indigeneity doesn't have some sort of statute of limitations. So, I mean, my people are indigenous, whether it's now or 1,000 years from now. If we maintain those 5 things, we're indigenous. Now, that's why the mainstream tries so hard to make us assimilate. Now, and to put it into Jewish terms, it's the exact same thing. This is why the Jewish people have fought assimilation basically from their outset. If you allow someone to take away your language, if you allow someone to remove you from your ancestral land, if you allow someone to tell you that you don't really have those blood connections, I mean, these are all the things that they do to force us to assimilate and become mainstream. Now, they do that to Métis people. They do that to the Maagna in Nicaragua. They do that to Jews. They do that to any indigenous people, anybody who they consider to be outside the mainstream. That's why they push assimilation as a virtue, when to us, assimilation literally means the death of our people. So when we're talking about indigeneity, we need to be very, very firm. Look, Jews have been in exile, and this is an important part of the discussion I don't think is really mentioned enough, because it's a little bit embarrassing, I think, when you have to admit that you were forcibly removed from your ancestral homeland. I admit it, my people are not from Paddle Prairie. Where I'm talking to you right now from is Paddle Prairie Métis settlement in northern Alberta. Now, it is a Métis settlement. My dad was one of the people that actually helped cement our land rights here. They created what they called the Métis Accords, which give us land rights. But this is not my ancestral land. My people were forcibly removed from the Red River, which is in Manitoba, which is 1,000 miles away from here. So we're not living on my ancestral land, even though this is now technically a Métis settlement. It's not my ancestral land. So a Jew who was forcibly exiled, you know, say to Lithuania or to Eastern Europe somewhere, or, you know, Spain even, or Rome, doesn't matter. They were forcibly exiled. That doesn't remove the fact that they are originally indigenous to Israel. It doesn't remove the fact that Jews have everything that makes them Jewish comes from Israel. Your lunar calendar, your holidays, all that stuff doesn't really make sense when you put it in a European context. Like, you know, Sukkot. Who wants to stay outside in Poland in October? I mean, it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? I mean, and if there were Jews in Paddle Prairie, I guarantee you they don't want to sleep outside in October. It's just, it's not a thing. It doesn't make sense, right?
Right.
And I think that that's part of the problem with these discussions is that, like, one of the things I notice is that a lot of Jews, the knowledgeable ones, and I hate to use these terms but it's true. The Jews that are knowledgeable about this stuff, they almost make assumptions that everybody is. And what they don't realize is that there's a profound ignorance about Jewish people. It is a very deep lack of knowledge. And what happens when there's a lack of knowledge? People make shit up to fill the hole. So that's why you see all this absolute nonsense being spread about Jewish people, because they don't have any actual knowledge. And unfortunately, in America, you have a lot of I'll say it, you have a lot of profoundly ignorant Jews who don't really know a whole lot about Jewish history or Jewish culture or Jewish tradition. And so what do? They fill the hole, right? So when they fill the hole, now say I'm just a random dude and I don't know any Jews, and I meet a Jewish kid in university and I say, hey dude, explain Purim to me. Oh, we just get really, really drunk. Oh, okay. So then I go away thinking that Purim is just an excuse for Jews to get really, really drunk. I don't know anything about the story of Esther. You know, I don't really learn anything about, basically the pyramid, the hierarchy pyramid, and how Jews can get near the apex of the pyramid. But when they get up high enough, someone pushes them down again. And I don't learn that that's a significant aspect of Jewish history, and that it's an incredibly important piece of that, because it's something other people can learn from. Instead, I go away thinking, well, my Jewish friend said they just get really drunk. So that's why it's so vital for us to be able to educate people and to teach them the importance of these traditions, the actual full whole story, and why these things happened the way they happened. I mean, because all of a sudden it goes from Jews get really drunk on Purim to this is an incredibly deep and moving story about a group of people who attained, they literally in the Persian Empire, they had attained positions of power almost near the apex. They were as close to the emperor as you could get. And yet all it took really was one guy to say, they have a lot of stuff and we could take their stuff if we push them down. And all of a sudden, all these people who had worked so hard to become near the apex of society, suddenly they were all, pushed back down again. And that shows how very fragile it is for anybody outside the mainstream to achieve a position of power in the mainstream, because we're still outsiders. Right?
Oh, your statement is very well taken. I'm going to take your statement and break your part in certain ways. First of all, how did you hear about Jews yourself? What was the thing that, what was your first impressions of Jews when growing up as a child? Did you know Jews existed, and how did they exist, and so forth?
Yeah. Well, okay, so this is kind of a multifaceted story, because my very, very first experience at all with anything Jewish at all was in Sunday school as a small child, right? So I grew up Roman Catholic. My mother was Roman Catholic. My dad's not religious at all. So what my mom would do is every Sunday, she'd bundle me up, send me to Sunday school. So the priest, I didn't realize this at the time. I mean, now looking back with the experience that I have, his name was Father Mercury. He was a wicked anti-Semite. And I had no clue about that because there's no Jews in Northern Alberta. Okay, so first off, there might be now, but when I was growing up, there sure weren't. And, I think it's too cold, right? But there was no Jewish people here. So my only experience was with Father Mercury teaching us the New Testament and the Old Testament. Now, I'm going to use that just for ease of use. The reality is it's the Christian New Testament. I mean, because it's hard to have a New Testament unless you don't believe in the Old. But the way I look at it is I was taught certain things. Now, when I was a kid, it was very pushed on us that the New Testament is more important than the Old Testament. That was a very big part of what they taught in Sunday school. So the priest one time, this is my favorite story about this because it kind of explains everything. The priest says, I want you guys to all go home and pick your favorite story from the Bible. Now, he didn't say from the New Testament or the Old Testament. He just said your favorite story from the Bible. So then, next Sunday we get to Sunday school. We're all sitting around in a circle. And he's asking all the kids, what's your favorite story? And most of the kids are like, I liked when Jesus turned water into wine. And I liked when Jesus made lots of fishes and bread. Like typical little kid things, right? And then they get to me and he said, so what's your favorite story? And I said, I like the Maccabees because they kicked ass.
Wow.
And he looked at me and he said, but Ryan, don't you think you should pick a story from the New Testament? And I remember how much trouble I got into because I said, no, that's boring. And he's like, wow. What do you mean? I said, well, yeah. I was like, it's boring. I said, I like the Old Testament better. I said, because the Old Testament, it has lots of fights and it talks about people and it makes more sense. So he sent me home.
Really?
He basically said, no, you need to go home. So what I learned was that, they talked lots about love and acceptance, but it was love and acceptance on their terms.
Their terms.
And so, even as a child, I was kind of like, I don't know about this Christian stuff. Like my grandmother, she was Christian and lovely lady. She was the president of the Catholic Women's League. But even so, like I would hear the priest say something and then I would ask my grandma about it. And my grandma would be like, no, don't listen to him about that. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Mm-hmm. And I remember thinking, but if the priest is supposed to be the authority, right? Mm-hmm. So that was my first dealing with, this idea that Jews, now my first actual, I guess my first aha moment was that right. when I realized that Jews are not just some concept from the Bible was when I was in university. Mm-hmm. I met a girl and she was my girlfriend's friend. And I went to her house for Shabbat dinner and I didn't even realize it was a Shabbat dinner. They were very down low about a lot of things. They didn't, they weren't really open that they were Jews. I think she never told me she was Jewish. So I remember it was a Friday. Now Catholics don't eat meat on Friday. So like observant Catholics. So red meat. So when they brought out a fish course and then they brought out some chicken soup and then they brought out a chicken, I thought they were just super Catholic. like super Catholic, lit candles and stuff.
Right.
But then I was looking around and I was like, wait a minute, like there's no crucifixes in the house because every Catholic house has a crucifix, and there's no picture of the Last Supper.
Right.
And I don't know if you know this, but almost every Catholic house has a picture of the Last Supper.
Yes, right.
So I was just kind of like, yeah, I was like, what the hell's with these Catholics? Like they're, on the one hand, they're super Catholic, and on the other hand, they're not.
Right.
So, you know, and then all of a sudden, when I found out they were Jews, I was like, huh, you know, and to be blunt, if she wouldn't have been such a nice person, none of this stuff probably would have happened at all for me. Because when you make a relationship with somebody, when they're a good friend, you stand up for them.
Right.
And that's basically how I got involved. I had a friend. I saw a friend getting bullied. I saw a friend having people pushing irrational hatred towards her, and it motivated me to stand up and say, that's not okay. I'm not okay with that.
Mm-hmm. So good question is, as you were, thank you for the story, as you were learning about Judaism and Jewishness, did you start seeing that so many things in the Catholic religion or the Christian religion, even later on in Islam, were basically imitations of Judaism and Jewish way?
Absolutely. So the biggest thing for me is going to sound funny. I went to a Jewish friend's brother's funeral, and he's a good friend of mine. And I've learned a lot from him over the years. Now, the funny thing is about my friend Corey is he's a secular, like he's about as secular as it gets. He's pretty chill. You know, he doesn't keep kosher in the house. He's a, like, you know, stereotypical North American Jewish person that's kind of, you know, not observant. But his dad was a Mahalnik. So like his dad was a guy that actually went to Israel to fight in the War of Independence, even though they were Canadian citizens. He didn't care. So, I mean, I've learned a lot from this guy. So I'm sitting at his brother's funeral with him, and I'm sitting, you know, like the family all sits together, and I was close friends. So I was sitting one row back, and we're sitting there, and I'm just struck by how many things they're happening in the funeral are exactly the same as the funerals that I've gone to growing up. But the biggest difference is there's a lot less standing up and sitting down. Like in Catholics, that's what we do, stand up and sit down every 10 seconds, right? Mm-hmm. So I said to him, he said to me, he said, so what do you think? Because like he knew that was the first time I'd ever been to a Jewish funeral. Right. And I said, you know, it's a lot like a Catholic funeral. Like it's very similar. So he smiled and he said, well, you know, we were here first, so it's more like the Catholics are like our funerals. Right. So right. I laughed because he's absolutely right. Like he wasn't wrong. Right. But I did start to notice that there's so many things that the Christians do that they directly come from Judaism. Like, but that's one of the reasons why I get irritated when people say Judeo-Christian ethics, because I'm like, no, they're Jewish ethics viewed through a Christian lens. Correct. But I mean, it's still Jewish ethics. Everything at the core is still Jewish, right? Right. So it's I think that's another thing. We need to be very firm when we're talking to people about that stuff, because the truth is, like, you know, if you're going to talk about, you know, like this new root and branch Christianity, they call it, right, they really do have to make sure that people understand that the trunk is Jewish. Mm-hmm. Like the trunk and the roots, everything came from Judaism. Like you guys thought of it first. You remind me, once in university, I had a friend, and I said to him, listen, do me a favor, open this book. The book was Leviticus, chapter 19, verse 18. So he opens up Leviticus, chapter 19, verse 18, and he reads, love thy neighbor as thyself, for I am God. And he was stunned because he was a Catholic. He said, wait a second, this is in your book? Yeah. Said, yeah. He says, what are you talking about? You talking about our founder? You know, Jesus didn't say this? No, your founder was in yeshiva. He went to rabbinical school. He went to every other school at that time. When was this? This was written by God, gave it to Moses 1,000 years before the guy was born. Oh my goodness, he was in total shock. You should have seen his face. Yeah. You know, the idea of the example, the having the blood, sort of the wine, the wafer, and so forth. Every single week, what do we have in terms of Kiddush? The Friday night, you bless the wine, and then you eat the challah, the bread. So, and I have friends who became Jewish, they were Catholic once, and they said that's exactly what, you know, where we learned the wafer and the wine, the communion, and so forth. It's a weekly thing done every Friday night. It's a Jewish thing. So you're right, many rituals and many ethics and so forth. But that brings me to a point you said before about standing up for someone. I remember once I was traveling in Wyoming and then Arizona, and I was in a convenience store. There's a young lady there, a young girl, about 18, 19 years old. And I started talking to her.
And she asked her where you're coming from and so forth. And then as I was more and more talking to her, she mentioned to me that she is an Indian. I think maybe a Apache or something like that. I'm not sure. I don't recall. And she said in such a very quiet, very somber way, very like she had no confidence in herself. I said to her, "Why are you saying like that for? You should be proud of yourself. You're Apache. You have an incredible history." So, "You serious?" She says, "Yes, absolutely, it's very serious." You know, she says, "People make fun of me. People put me down, so forth." Absolutely not. Just the opposite. At that moment, I realized the connection between Indians, American Indians, and the Jewish people, and other people who've been abused and so forth. The higher power, so to speak, meaning what? The people in charge, the majority, make the minority feel so incompetent, so low, so inferior that they begin to doubt themselves. And the worst part is that they, as you mentioned before, they lack the education, they lack the knowledge of themselves. And so instead of seeing how great they really are, they want to be more and more into the fabric of the bigger society. And I take a very good point what you're mentioning about you mentioned the circle of Jews who don't know what's going on. So they think, okay, it's just a drinking holiday, Purim. And so they themselves don't feel what's so special about it. I'll associate with the bigger culture, the more dominant culture. And that is something that has happened, unfortunately, to all indigenous people. They begin to doubt themselves. And then they lose their sense of worth. So how do you would address that in terms
100%.
of indigenous people, Jewish and non-Jewish?
Well, it's one of the things that I've done since I started getting involved with this is I like when I talk to Jewish groups and Jewish advocates, I always tell them, okay, never forget that at the center of what we're doing here is Jewish identity. And it's the same thing when I'm talking to Native groups. If I'm talking to a Cree group, I tell them, remember, like the center of what we're doing here is Cree identity. Or if I'm talking to the Blackfoot, the center of what I'm doing here is Blackfoot identity. The reason that we want people to focus on that is because there's a modern push to define ourselves by standards that we don't even accept as indigenous people. So like if I'm Jewish, I would get upset if somebody was trying to tell me that the only way you can define a Jewish person is by the level of observance. Or conversely, the only way you can define a Jewish person is by genetics. Like you're an ethno-religious tribal people. That means, again, those 5 things that I talked about are all very integral parts of your identity. And when you start cutting a finger off of a hand, what happens? The hand becomes less and less functional until pretty soon all you have is a stump.
Mhm.
And the stump isn't very useful. So you really need to focus and you need to work on bringing back the blood ties, the cultural ties, the tradition, the language, and the spirituality. Now, I'm not saying you have to believe in God, but what I'm saying is that you should at least know what your people, what their traditions are when it comes to believing in God, right? I have some secular friends in Israel, and they would fight you if you tried to tell them that they're not secular. But they keep Shabbat,
Mhm.
right? They keep kosher in the home,
Right.
and like they would be considered Orthodox Jews in North America. But in Israel, it's just that's what you do because you live in Israel, and Israel is Jewish, and that's just how you roll. So we need more people to understand that if you're manifesting an authentic identity, that's the key to everything. And look, I'm not saying that people that are doing their own thing aren't authentic, but I'm talking about authentic as in authentic to the Jewish tradition and culture and
Mhm.
spirituality. Like, and it's no different than my people. Look, we have a huge problem with what we call plastic shamans, right?
Mhm.
Basically, what they are these elders, and they teach like a modernist, new agey, pan-Indian kind of, I call it pan-Indian bullshittery, because that's what it is. It's just nonsense. And they teach this, and they teach it as, well, this is traditional Native belief. And it's like, no, it's not. And when we don't speak up about that, what ends up happening is that there's a very real danger of that replacing authentic Native belief systems. And these authentic Native belief systems are already under direct threat because most of our tribes and nations in North America are in the midst of losing our languages.
Mhm.
And anybody that studies this stuff knows the first step to assimilation is to remove the language, because and I'm sure as a Jewish person, you know this, there are certain concepts that make sense in Hebrew.
Correct.
And when you say them in Hebrew, they make perfect, total sense. But when you say them in English, there's not really an English word that you have to kind of fiddle with it and use multiple words, but it's not exactly the same, right? And it's the same thing with a lot of native languages here in North America. There's Cree terms and Cree words that don't have an English translation. So, how would I be able to teach this authentically without it?
That's a very good point. You talk about language. Language is identity. If you in the liturgy in the Nusach in Hebrew, with the prayer books and so forth, every time we always mention the Shanot, it means the tongue. Language is what identifies you as a human being, as your nation, as your national consciousness. And when sometimes I tutor kids here in America, sometimes when I'm in America, and it's so sad. I speak to the parents. I tell the parents, I want you to understand something. The Romans, they themselves are the greatest eyewitnesses. Says, how so? They called us Jews. What does that mean? That means they saw as 2,000-year-old witnesses from back in the day that we come from Judea, we're Judeans. And that being the case, our language is Hebrew. Isn't it sad? I told them that basically your child is so good in English or maybe French, but Hebrew they can't read. That's your native language. That's your identity. And here you have that's the children in Israel who can speak Hebrew. So when people say, "Oh, I can't learn Hebrew, it's so hard," no, Hebrew is your native language. Even more so. I sometimes tell people there's 1.5 million non-Jewish people speaking Hebrew. Who? That's Israeli Arabs. They speak Hebrew. So then the Israeli Arabs can speak Hebrew and Arabic. Then certainly someone who's Jewish should be able to speak Hebrew. And when you speak a language, you identify. It totally changes you psychologically, spiritually, and so forth. Its language really is your essence. So here, back to the question. Now I'm going to be a different question. How come your 5 things can't fit the Palestinians? Why can't they also fit Palestinians? Why can't Palestinians be the indigenous and have their Palestinian state?
So, yeah, okay. So, here's the thing. Generally when I talk, and I think this actually kind of frustrates people, generally when I talk, I tend to focus much more on Jewish people just because I try to focus on being positive when I'm doing advocacy. Like, I've always thought that advocacy is about making people uncomfortable, but at the same time motivating them to change the things that are making them uncomfortable. Whereas I find that, the Arabs, the Palestinians, the way that they do advocacy is very different. They are constantly just trying to make Jews look bad. So everything that they do has the end result of Jews are bad, right? So the one advantage they have is that it's a very simple and very focused narrative. So, I mean, they'll talk about colonialism. They'll talk about, pretty much everything, apartheid. They'll use lots of buzzwords, but it's all the end result is the same thing. The end result is Jews are bad, right? That's their advocacy. So my advocacy is much more, well, let's just stay completely fact-based. Let's avoid ascribing values. Like I always tell people, look, I don't ascribe a value of being indigenous over being non-indigenous, except as an indigenous person, clearly I am going to be biased towards my own people. That's natural. That's not wrong. That's how we should be doing things. We should have a hierarchy of loyalty that goes family, clan, tribe, nation. That's my people. That's how I roll. And if they don't like it, too bad. Now, the thing with the Arabs, to answer your question, is really quite simple. And I do this, it's kind of a dirty trick, but it's it makes sense. And it's not really a dirty trick because it's honest. If you can name 3 things that are strictly Palestinian, I don't mean, variations on things that other Arabs do. I don't mean like, they put pine nuts and onions in their chicken. Like, you have to give me 3 things that are genuinely Palestinian manifestations of cultural constructs. If they can do that, then I'm done. I'll tell them, okay, you guys are indigenous and we'll fire it up. I'll support you with whatever I can. But the truth of the matter is they don't, right? So when we go language, we start off with language. What language do the Palestinians speak? Well, they speak Arabic. That's their main language. So that's language. Now, land. They do claim that they have ancestral ties to the land. And you know what? After 1,000 years, they do have rights of longstanding presence. But if you take a look at people's stories, now that's how you can tell when someone's really connected to an ancestral land. Every single story in the Old Testament takes place in the land of Israel. Every single one. And the majority of them take place in Judea and Samaria, which are now the areas that the Palestinians are really challenging and saying, well, no, that's our ancestral land. So if all of these stories show that there is a Jewish tie and connection to the land, okay, cool. Then I want you to show me some Palestinian stories. I want you to show me some villages and like some, you know, some landmarks that are where they have some actual stories that go with that. And I don't mean some village making up a Johnny fell down the hill over there, so therefore that's Johnny's hill. I mean, show me an actual story, right? And I don't mean, you know, how they talk about Muhammad riding to heaven on a magic donkey. You know, that doesn't do it for me. Like that, I'm sorry, that doesn't work. I need something a little more concrete than that. So what have we established there? Language, land, okay. Now blood, they that's the easiest one, because a lot of them claim that they're part Jewish, but they don't claim it in public, right? Because they don't want people to know that they might carry Jewish blood and that they were forcibly colonized Jews. And then but when they're talking to you in private, they'll say stuff like, my family used to light candles on Friday night, you know, and like, because they're trying to get you on side, but at the same time, they don't want to admit that they're Jewish in public, because we all know what that would mean, okay? So that's the blood. The culture stuff, I mean, that's very clear.
So to interpret what I'm saying, you've actually met Palestinians? Yeah. Really?
Oh, yeah. I stayed for a week. I think it was my second trip. I lived with a family in the West Bank, just outside of Ramallah for a week. So I'm not just some guy that wanted to only take one side of the story. Anybody that follows me on social media knows that I'm a very evidence and fact-based kind of guy. Like I need to see things myself. I need to make determinations. I need to think critically about something, and without hearing both sides, I could never really take one side. So, but getting back to what I was saying now, so what we said, language, land, culture. So culture, they're Arabs, right? Like they make it very clear. They'll tell you point blank, we're Arabs. And they started doing that, you know, in the 1960s when they started with I think it was 67, when they said, no, we're Palestinians. But before that, they were South Syrians and Jordanians. Like, they're not consistent with how they self-identify. So they can't say that there's anything cultural Palestinian, because Palestinian as a culture didn't really develop until, you know, 1967. That's a pretty early development. Like that's a recent development. And then spirituality, that's the central one. Spirituality, I think somebody was telling me it's like 90% Muslim now. So if they're Muslims, then, and they're Arabs, and all that stuff tracks back, they are indigenous people, absolutely, to the Hijaz. So they would be indigenous to the Hijaz, which is the Arabian Peninsula. And that's okay. Like, the big thing is that indigeneity is site specific. So what that means, your people are not indigenous to Morocco, right? And this is why I get annoyed with, like, there's certain Jewish groups that advocate for all this, you know, we're Jews from different places. Well, that's cool, but you're still indigenous to Israel. Jews are not indigenous to North Africa. Jews are not indigenous to Morocco, Tunisia. You're not indigenous to those places. You're indigenous to Israel, and you were forced to move to those places either through exile or through migration. But either way, you're not indigenous to those places. Just like Arabs, just because they conquered the entire Middle East in the 7th century during what they call the Islamic conquest, that doesn't make them indigenous to the entire Middle East. They're still indigenous to their origin point, which is in the Hijaz. And remember, the very first question you asked me was about what's that?
So basically,
the very first question you asked me was about, you know, the indigenous statute of limitations. There isn't one, so it doesn't change. Just because they've conquered all of those places across the Middle East, they don't suddenly become indigenous to Syria, or they don't become indigenous to Iraq. Those are still not Arab places. There's indigenous people in those places that were subsumed.
In other words, basically, since the 7th century, you're saying they've been conquering all different places. They basically maybe one of the longest terms historically occupiers in the world. They're basically occupiers.
Absolutely. They're actually one of the most effective. Yeah. Look, people don't like when I say this because they're like, oh, that's a really mean way to look at it. But it's the truth. As an indigenous person, I don't care if it's an indigenous people that's occupying someone else. That's not how it works. They're indigenous to the Hijaz. They are not indigenous to Israel. So in the context of Israel, they're not the indigenous people. They are a conquering colonizer. And it's the same thing across the Middle East. So if we were to talk about Iraq, or if we were to talk about Morocco, Tunisia, the Arabs were conquering colonizers. Now, it doesn't change that they were indigenous to the Hijaz, because they are technically still an indigenous people. But there's no rule saying indigenous people can't be conquerors or colonizers. It's just that they can't be conquerors or colonizers in their own ancestral land, right? So if the Jews were suddenly to become an imperialist people, and say the Jews decided to conquer, Iraq, then you would be a conquering colonizer. But Jews don't do that, so that's not really, it's not really a topic of conversation.
What you're saying basically is this way, that basically God, and so to speak, of God through history, through the last events, the last 100 years, has turned the tables around the colonizer, the occupier. Basically, he's brought back the indigenous people. It took 2,000 years, for whatever reason it may be, probably the longest exiled nation, indigenous nation, never forgetting its roots, constantly in our prayers. We constantly, 3 times a day, we mention Jerusalem, we mention the land of Israel, we mention when we on our grace after meals, we mention before we eat, after we eat, in weddings, breaking the glass, always to remember Jerusalem and so forth. So we're constantly obsessed. And if someone doesn't give up the claim to their land, their house, and so forth, then they can't say that they gave up. It's called in Hebrew to despair. They haven't given up anymore the hope of returning. We never gave up. That's what comes basically that tikva, the hope to come back. So the table has been turned, because no occupier ever thought that the ones who were captured, enslaved, and then thrown out would ever return back. And so the Jews have returned back to the land, and telling the occupiers, like you mentioned before, that it's time for them to understand that we're back home and you have to accept us. Now, when you see this as an indigenous person, how does that affect you in terms of your exile, being in exile on your own land itself?
Well, it's awesome. Yeah, look, the easiest way for me to say how does it affect me was when I went on my very first trip to Israel. A group named Stand With Us. They basically, the founder had read some of the articles that I wrote, and she basically said, this guy needs to go to Israel and see everything for himself. And, I'll be forever grateful to them, because I mean, they sent me to Israel for almost 10 days, and I had the most incredible trip. I'm pretty sure it's probably the greatest trip anybody's ever had. It was insane. It was sun up to sundown, constant traveling, going all over Israel and seeing and meeting Israelis and seeing the entirety of Israel. And I'll tell you what I told my friends when I came home. There's nothing quite like seeing what it looks like when indigenous people win. When indigenous people manage to regain their ancestral land, to see that and see just to see and experience how it feels. I mean, I actually am kind of sad a lot that a lot of my Jewish friends don't understand how ridiculously awesome it is. Like, it's something it's difficult to put into words. I mean, every indigenous people on the planet are fighting for self-determination on our ancestral lands, and here you have a group of people that achieved it, and a lot of them, they don't even realize what a big deal that is. To them it's like, Israel, Yeah. And it's like, dude, it's like we would literally give everything we have to have what you have. And they don't understand, why is that such a big deal? Because this is the goal. The goal is for us to be able to protect our own sacred places. And admittedly, Israel's still working towards that. And I think that they need to try harder, and they need to push harder, because I think that they'll find if they do that, they'll get more support, not less. Mm-hmm. Because I think by not forcing the issue for the Machpelah and for the Temple Mount, they send a conflicting message to a lot of Native people, because a lot of Native people want to support Israel, because we realize, hey, wait a sec, they are indigenous people and they have achieved self-determination on a national level. But to us, it's like one of the first things that we would do if we achieved national self-determination was we would protect our sacred places. So for us, it's kind of a little bit of a conflict because we see you've achieved that. And, you know, even with the nation law, you even made a national law saying it's the nation state of the Jewish people, which is, to us, it's like, that's amazing. That's what you need. But then at the same time, you have people that are like, well, if we could get peace by giving away the most sacred place in the world to Jews, then we would do it. We're like, but you wouldn't get peace. Like, we already know that you're not going to get peace that way. Like this whole land for peace thing, we always joke because the only thing you get when you trade land for peace is nothing, because you don't get land, you lose land, and you don't get peace. So it's a stupid plan, and it's never worked.
That's a very good point. So you mentioned before about the idea of the person who's indigenous and how you're seeing it, and how you're inspired by it. So, but at the same token, many times we read that BDS tries to say that the American Indian and the Palestinian are the one that we had, they side with them. Now you're telling me just the opposite. You're saying, oh, what you're really saying is that the American Indian, the South American Indian, the indigenous people see the Jewish people as the true indigenous people coming back home and inspiring everyone that you can do it. So the thing is, maybe from your perspective, maybe you experience and unexperienced, but I've had the so to speak, the pleasure of being both parts of the world, being from Israel, living in America, and seeing two different mentalities, and going through that American, so to speak, that exile mentality, because I was trying to understand what happens, is that unfortunately the people here are so exiled, not just physically, but psychologically. They can't even recognize themselves as human beings. Case in point, I've seen pictures of you that you're a very big man. Okay. So people usually identify someone who's very big, is very strong, and so forth, should have a lot of power, should be able to go into a room, so to speak, and dominate everything. What happens if a person is your size or bigger, whatever, or whatever type of athletic talent, but sees themselves as a very, 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 very insecure person? All of a sudden, all the strength means nothing, because basically it's like a big teddy bear that can't do anything. Right? And that is the problem with exiled people, because their mentality has been so warped, so damaged. As of one, I don't know if you ever heard, there's a great commentator named Ibn Ezra, and he makes an amazing statement. This is by the Torah, when the Jews are about to cross the Red Sea. There's 600,000 soldiers, men with the weapons. These are Jews, supposedly soldiers, just came out of slavery. And the chariots of Egypt coming. And Ibn Ezra says they could not fight back. Why couldn't they fight back? Because they were still slaves in their minds. They saw their masters coming. Even how 600,000 men with weapons on their belts, and they had no sense of confidence. Maybe that's an answer to your question.
No, absolutely. So I guess like what I've noticed is that a lot of North American Jews, especially, they struggle, you know, with the importance not just of Jewish identity in general, but they really struggle with the importance of Israel, you know, the connection to their people. And I think there is a large amount of, you know, because they want so badly to be part of the mainstream, right? And the mainstream is like kind of the goal. It's always been the goal of everybody to be popular, to be liked, right?
Right.
But the truth of the matter is, like you said, so when I was a kid, we had horses, and I said to my dad one day, like, because he would tie the horse to the pole all the time, and the horse for the first couple of days they pull and they struggle and they try to get loose, and after a couple of days I noticed that Dad wasn't even tying the horse to the post anymore. He would just lay the reins on the post and walk away. And I said to him, I said, well, like, what, like, why don't you keep tying it up? And he said, because he's not going to pull anymore, right? And it's something that when you know, yeah, I know it's deep, right? Like
very deep,
because you realize, wait a second, that's what we do, right? Like a lot of us, especially when we're younger, we try to go our own way. You know, like you see little kids, they want to wear like Spider-Man outfits and stuff to school. They don't give a crap. They just want to be themselves.
Right.
But then they slowly have mainstream keep telling them, no, you don't be different, don't be weird. So,
Yeah.
I think that the biggest struggle that we're going to have is getting a lot of these people to realize, wait a second, you don't have to be like everybody else. And in fact, being like everybody else shouldn't be the goal.
Right.
Right. Like when I talk to Jewish groups, like especially I work with a group called Club Z a lot, and they work directly with high school kids. Instead of telling them, don't be chicken and don't be cowards, I don't say don't be cowards. I tell them, stand up, be brave. You'll have people that will support you. Like, that's the best part about groups like that, is they get to see that, you know what? They're not the only kid. They're not the only person that's ever experienced this. And they'll have support from other kids that go through the same thing. Right? All of a sudden, Zionism, instead of being a dirty word, Zionism becomes an important part of their identity. And that's the kind of thing we should be pushing. Like, we should be telling, look, there's so many wonderful, amazing things about being Jewish, but why focus on things that are hard, or focus on the things that are, like with people hating you and all that? Don't focus on that. Focus on the fact that you have this amazing tradition in history. Focus on the fact that you are the one group of people who managed to regain control of your ancestral land. Focus on the things like that. Focus on the fact that Jews are disproportionately successful in academics and sciences. Focus on those things. Make sure that these kids have a reason to be proud, right? And then suddenly you're going to start seeing, instead of walking around with their heads down and being embarrassed and ashamed about being Jews, you're going to have a group of kids that are going to be like, yeah, you know what? I'm Jewish. And if you don't like it, tough shit. Like, I'm okay with who I am. And that's what we need. We need a generation of warriors instead of a generation of politicians.
Right.
And that's the same thing with my community.
Very good. You remind me when I was in high school, and I told my friend, said, make my friend, I told him, make my other friend smart, strong, brave, great, an athletic fighter, make him Jewish. He said to me, no, that's not Jewish, that's Israeli. That's just so that, and that is exactly what happened. The Israeli mentality is basically the new Jew, the Jew that goes back to its land. The Jew came back to his land, came back to his warrior roots, came back to his manly roots, came back to his self-identity, came back to his confidence, came back to being tribal and yet a nation one time at the same time, being one with the land again, being able to pray to his God, to God in the land that he was raised with, thought about his language and stuff, to identify himself. It's interesting to note that the Zionist writers, when they first came back home to Israel from Europe, they spend not only hours, in the field, but after work, they spend hours on changing their psyche, getting rid of that exile mentality. It went to the extreme, and he would call it the geva, being the real man, taking the rifle and being brave and being strong. So the question over here is, when you have these types of situations, why would you say, and how could you prove that Zionism is not Nazism? Isn't supposed to know Zionism, but the idea of where you're about to take people, conquer them, make an apartheid, or get rid of people's rights of quote unquote, who are the majority, these are the Palestinians, and Zionism has only brought terrible things to the world? Or are you saying maybe Zionism is not? Maybe Zionism is something positive? Show me how.
Yeah. So I think that for me, the first thing I always do is I always say, well, if we're going to have any kind of discussion, first we have to make sure that we're talking about the same things, right? Because the biggest problem nowadays is when we're having a conversation, well, half the time we're not speaking the same language. We seem like we're speaking the same language because we're both speaking in English, but they're coming from a very left-wing, very reactionary point of view, and I'm coming from a very right-wing, fact-based point of view. And it's even sad that I even have to say that fact-based has become right-wing, but it really has. Facts and science are no longer bipartisan. Facts and science are clearly in support of one side over the other, which is sad, but it's reality. So what I tell them is, okay, first things first, we're going to define Zionism, okay? I want you to tell me what you think Zionism actually means. Tell me what the definition of Zionism is. And then you tell me how that meets all of these things that you're telling me. You're telling me that Zionism is fascism, Zionism is all these different things. I want you to tell me how does that apply, okay? Because then what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you Zionism is very simple. It's the right of Jews to have self-determination on their ancestral land. If you believe in that, you're a Zionist. If you don't believe in that, you're not a Zionist. It's that simple. Either you believe that Jews have a right to national self-determination on Jewish ancestral land, or you don't. Now, you want to say that, okay, but that's fascism. No, it's not fascism. An indigenous people returning to their ancestral homeland and achieving self-determination is the opposite of fascism. So you need to be able to understand, and you need to understand these concepts in terms well enough that you can make, statements like that and sound authoritative. You don't want to come across as, well, Zionism is the right of Jews. You can't do that. You have to be able to say it loud. You have to be able to say it strong, right? And that's one of the things I think is wonderful about that program that I'm working with at Club Z, because they teach these young kids before they get on campus. They teach these kids before they have some idiot screaming in their face that Zionism is fascism and Zionism is racism, because it's not. Zionism is very simple. Like, at its core, it's about Jews wanting to go home. Now, who doesn't want to go home? Who doesn't want to live on their own ancestral land? Now, again, there is a problem here, because North America itself, the entire place, is someone else's ancestral home. So a lot of North Americans have this automatic bias against Israel because they apply what they believe is consistent thought, which is, okay, well, if the indigenous people achieve self-determination in Israel, what if the indigenous people achieve self-determination in North America? What does that mean for me, right? And they think, in their mind, because they project the way that they would do things, they think, well, that means that the Indians, if we achieve self-determination, would kick all the white people out, which is not the case. Like, most of the Native people that I know that advocate for Native self-determination, we want participatory power in the government. We don't want to kick all the white people out. We don't want to send them all back to Europe. That's stupid, and it doesn't even make sense. Our population is so much smaller than the population here now that wouldn't even be like a fair and equitable kind of settlement, because most of those people, they weren't here when all this stuff happened. I mean, you can't blame someone for the sins of the father, right? But what you can do is you can say, look, the system that's in place now is not a good system for anyone. And obviously, Native people should have more say because it is our land. So we need to find a way to navigate that and figure out a way that we can have more say without destroying what's already in place. So this whole idea that Zionism is racism, my favorite is Zionism is colonialism, because Zionism is the antithesis of colonialism. The whole idea that indigenous people can return to their ancestral land and achieve self-determination is exactly what the colonialists don't want. Mm-hmm. So these people that call Zionism colonialism, it's like either they're idiots or they're ignorant. Like, those are really the two choices.
You're saying something very special, very unique. That first, you're saying Zionism is a civil rights movement. It's a national liberation movement. It's a human rights movement. It's about human struggles. From your perspective, have you also seen that Zionism also cares about the other, meaning, in other words, the human rights of other individuals? Example, the Druze and the Arabs of Israel, who call themselves Palestinian, or Muslims, Christians, so forth. Is Zionism also, so to speak, also a national or a human movement, whereby other people are also inspired and uplifted by the ideals of Zionism? Have you seen that yourself?
Absolutely. Look, I was interviewed once on my first trip by an Israeli TV station, and they said, like, it was kind of funny because, like, they didn't sugarcoat it and they didn't lob me any softball questions. I mean, I'm some random Indian from North America, and they asked me, how would you solve the Middle East problem, right? Like, what kind of question is that to ask some random dude? So I just looked at her because, like, she kind of put me on the spot. So I looked at her and I said, once. And she didn't know what to say, but I had to explain to her. I said, look, like, I said, the one thing that I've noticed about Jews is that, if anything, you're too nice, right? And the narrative has been flipped, and they've turned you into these bloodthirsty savages that shoot Palestinians and kill Palestinian babies, and it's all bullshit. And when you actually examine it, you can't help but see how wrong and how full of lies it is. So the truth is, when anybody examines the statistics, look, you're in the middle of a war in Gaza, and you're still sending humanitarian aid to Gaza. You supply electricity and water to Gaza, even when they're shooting rockets at you. Like, There's not another country on the planet that would do that, okay? There's no other group of people that I know of who put purity of arms so high in their military doctrine, right? When you talk to other people, one of the things, my university specialization was in military science and history.
Mm-hmm.
There is no other group of people in the history of the world who put civilians of an antagonistic entity, we'll call it, ahead of their own soldiers' lives. Like, I don't know if you know this, but like Israeli soldiers are not allowed to, when they're going into a house, they're not allowed to have, who's that? Is that me or you?
No, maybe it could be you.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll turn this off.
That's a wonderful, God, you're saying a wonderful thing.
Yeah, so it's like, but what I was trying to say, and it's an important, like it's a super important thing when you look at it like this. You're not allowed to go into a house with a bullet in the chamber because they know that split second could mean the difference between you shooting somebody and not shooting somebody. Every other military on earth would place the value of that soldier's life over whoever's in that house.
Correct.
Every other military. There's not a single, and like I have to be blunt, not a single military in the world that would put the civilian's life over the soldier's life other than Israel. So when I started actually digging into this stuff and learning, I was like, man, like I get it. Like, and I'm not going to lie. There's a reason why I tend to love a lot of Jewish people, because you are such good people. But at some point, sometimes you got to say, hey, you know what? And it frustrates me sometimes because, you know, like you guys, sometimes you're too nice. And what is it they say? Sometimes it's better to be cruel to the kind than kind to the cruel.
Right. It's so true. Sometimes I wonder if maybe if we have a non-Jewish leader as prime minister, things would be different, you know, because
yeah,
right.
They'd probably be a little more inclined to settling it.
Right, because why? For some reason,
look.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, look, like one of the things that I really love about Jewish people is that the fact that, you know, you have all of these stereotypes about Jews, right? That you're money obsessed and you're cheap, and yet my experience with Jewish people, and I'll be incredibly blunt here, my experience with Jewish people is the opposite. I've seen nothing but generosity from the Jewish community. I've seen nothing but selflessness. Like when I've met Jews from all over the world, that's the one thing that is very, like it seems to me like one of the core Jewish values is generosity. I mean, the fact that you guys give so much to charity, the fact that you guys do so much in the community, those things alone should be enough. But the sad part is they're not, because the average person doesn't see those things, right? So they hear these idiotic stereotypes about Jews, but since they don't know any Jews, they don't have the experience to say, wait a second, every Jew that I know is the opposite of that stereotype. So why is that stereotype being perpetuated, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I tell people, look, the best way to fight this kind of stuff and the best way to fight anti-Semitism is to be publicly Jewish. Be a Jew. Invite people to your home for Shabbat. If you have a Jewish friend and he hears some idiot say Jews are all cheap, and you have a good friend and he'd be like, well, I have Jewish friends, you idiot, and they're not cheap. Like, where did that even come from?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's kind of where we are now. Like, we have to start being a lot more vocal, but we have to be careful how we do it, right? Like, we don't want to be, like, if you argue vociferously against every time you see a swastika drawn in dust on a car window and you freak out, the guy that drew that swastika, it took him, 10 seconds?
Right.
And he walked away thinking, ha, 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 like, look at me, I'm so edgy.
Right.
And then you have, like, you know, the best way to deal with that is walk over, clean it off, and walk away. Not only did you not give him you gave him no satisfaction,
right, but
you also didn't make everybody else get that kind of fatigue where it's constant, right? We know anti-Semitism is serious and that it's getting really bad. The problem is you have to really decide which hill are you willing to die on, right? Like, because if you talk about it constantly, people tune out. People get tired of it and they're like, I had enough. I don't want to hear about it anymore.
Right.
Right. So we have to be strategic, because the idiots they're just going to keep spamming us with swastikas in the snow and swastikas in the dust,
Right.
like, you know, drawing stuff on the wall. They're going to keep doing that because it's easy and it gets them what they want, which is attention, right?
Right.
We have to be smart, and we have to fight smarter, not harder.
You remember a scene, I forgot which, I think it was a movie with Paul Newman once. He was playing Buffalo Bill, was it? Wild Bill Cody, Wild Bill Hickok? Maybe it was that was scene. Anyhow, there was this Sitting Bull was part of the show in the movie, and Sitting Bull comes into the arena, just sitting on his horse, dignified, not saying a word. And people seeing his incredible majesty and ability, and they just quiet down. And that's what we hear when a person shows who he is, his dignity, his majesty, his ethics, his morals, his history. You can't argue with that. You can't argue with that. And that's what you're saying.
Yeah.
And the thing is, which is, I know time is running out, so appreciate your time. But what's also so amazing is that when you have a person who's willing to stand up for himself and stand for the ideals, you also mentioned the fact of basically indirectly the idea of planet Jew. What is a planet Jew? People say, well, the Jews on that planet is Jews. They so and so and so, and you're saying, come visit planet Jew. Come to the Jewish planet, and you'll see for yourself. And once you see for yourself all these stereotypes, it's not, so to speak, the moon is made from cheese, and not with the big monsters and so forth. You'll see just the opposite. And if people want to say there's an apartheid, fine, let them come to Israel, and they say it for themselves. I truly appreciate this hour with you and your insights, and very wise and very very not just wise, but also very practical in terms of how to deal with these issues and so forth. If you want to say anything else to the audience, please, as a final word.
Oh, I appreciate that, Rabbi. You know, at the end of the day, I think that what I want people to start trying to take from the things that I'm saying is that it's important for the world that there be Jews, right? It's important for the world that there be Métis people. The world would be a much less colorful place if we all just went to be the mainstream, if we all just started knuckling under and doing what everybody else does. And I think it's vital that we explain to people that this is important for us. This is not just important for me as a Métis person that there be Métis people, but it's important for me as a Métis person that there be Jews. That it's not strange for me to stand up on behalf of Jewish people, and it's not strange for Jewish people to stand up on behalf of Métis people. We're all in this together. And at the end of the day, you know, like one of the greatest things I learned from my trip to Israel was that, you know, there's a group of people that really, none of the experts would have thought that you were going to achieve self-determination. There's not a single expert that would have said the Jews are going to win that fight, right? And you won. And you didn't just win. I mean, your people are not just surviving, you're thriving. So it's absolutely important for my people to be able to see that and understand what it is, because you made a good point earlier too, and I didn't get a chance to address it, but I should really quick. There are groups of Native people who are anti-Israel. And most of the time it's strictly out of ignorance. It's because they hear the colonial narrative coming from the other side. And instead of actually just examining the facts, because the facts speak for themselves, they follow along because that's the mainstream in that area. So they go with the mainstream instead of thinking for themselves. So when you start to actually pay attention to the facts and thinking for yourself, it becomes pretty obvious that there's one side that is actually the side we should be supporting, and that's the side of Indigenous people everywhere. So, and you know, I really appreciate the fact that you're giving me the opportunity to speak, Rabbi, because I find that lately, especially the last couple months here with all this American election stuff, people are kind of forgetting a lot of these really important things. And I think a lot of really important stuff is going unsaid, and we really need to be able to be more public with it.
Thank you so much for your hours, for your kindness, for your wisdom, and be blessed in everything. And may God, as He's returned our people back to our land, and return your people back to your land, and may the whole world become one united people under God.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Go to it. Bye-bye.